which of those, and we'll come on to discuss this on the allocation table, which of those options, what's actually proposed?
Option 1.
Option 1.
Plan. Option 3 was considered as set out and discussed with the Environment Agency and viability, but to deliver the, for example, to deliver the infrastructure required to deliver advanced assessments and support growth, that was not viable to provide that level of housing, and wasn't considered appropriate or necessary by the Environment Agency. Or
so what's option 3? Sorry,
option 3. It
was in that document, paragraph 5.77 says option 1 proposes development outside of flood zone 3. The vast majority of development is proposed outside of flood zone 2. In option 3, all residential development is removed from flood zone 2 and 3. This fully respects the model flood zones and looks to minimise the impact of development on waterways. Then it says this is an extreme application of the sequential approach. And I read that and thought, well, this is an extreme application of the sequential approach. But is the sequential approach just not a pass or fail? There's no sort of, or we failed it a little bit, or is it right to say it's an extreme application of sequential? It's quite
It's a
clear.
specific question, haven't you?
Pass or fail, isn't it, really?
How it would. And we've provided it. And this is where, and it's, you know, my understanding, and apologies, I'm not a flood engineer, but you've obviously got the sequential test, which is what we're discussing with the question. Then you've got the sequential approach when it comes to master planning on the ground, where you steer development towards flood zone 2. But I think, as we mentioned in our hearing statement, actually residential development is in line with the table in the PPG about less vulnerable, more vulnerable, highly vulnerable uses. I think it's a more vulnerable use, which is actually acceptable in flood zone 2, subject to the appropriate, you know, measures that you secure through determination of planning applications. And you don't need to do the exception test. And it's actually got a tick on it and it's acceptable. And I think that's where Mr. Bourne was discussing there's a slight tension in approach. So, and I do have to say, sorry, because I did make an error in my previous question, because you have got a specific question on matter 6 issue 1 about land use paddock word and that wholly being in, can that wholly be delivered in flood zone 1? And that's the answer that I was giving, where and that's on my mind. But acknowledging that a small proportion of housing through this will be is being shown on flood zone 2, but I would refer you to the statement of common grounds we have with the Environment Agency, and so more to which are satisfied with the approach, and the wider point, which I know was mentioned again this morning, about the fact that we're planning for flood betterment, and how is that a consideration, and why should that be a consideration? And actually referring you back to paragraph 73A of the NPPF, which does say that when planning on a strategic scale, you can provide, I haven't got it in front of me now word for word, but opportunities for significant infrastructure to provide enhanced opportunities, enhanced situation for existing population. So it's those considerations in the round, but we are being fully alive to the flood risk issues on Western Paddock Wood, and through the master planning, which JBA, who are our retained flood risk consultants, also form part of the David Lock Associates team. And you'll see, I think it's Appendix E of core document 3.66. There's a master planning note attached to that as well. I've gone on a tangent now, apologies, but it has been considered, and the sequential approach has been accepted, and what we're proposing through option 1 has been agreed by the Environment Agency.
So to sum up, the sequential approach at strategic level is followed, because there are areas of flood zone 1 to the west of Paddock Wood. Yes, there are areas of flood zone 2, but there are areas of flood zone 1, and that was considered. When we then come on to look at the sequential test at a borough scale, or indeed at a very site-specific scale, as Mr. Jones just said, and looking at flood vulnerability, the PPG and PPF are clear that housing, where it doesn't include basements, is appropriate in flood zone 2, and it's specifically that's referred to in the chart, and that the exception test is not required when there is development at that point, when there is is such a vulnerability of development in flood zone 2. So the council's view is that it was right to consider west of Paddock Wood further. It did so. We've spoken before about its conclusions and its reasons for that being part of the development. But we've continued to consider the sequential approach to flooding all the way down, including through the master planning process.
Presumably, and this is a slight hypothetical situation in question, but presumably you could have an allocation area of land, part of it is flood zone 1, part of it is flood zone 2, part of it is flood zone 3, and you could allocate that, and if you had a development policy on principle that said, development should avoid flood zones 2 and 3, then presumably that would still pass the discretion test, because you're in effect allocating the bit in flood zone 1. The fact you included the whole area within your red line that might be used for other things, landscaping, open space, etc., etc.
And so before, I know that we'll talk about it more on the Paddock Wood page, but there is the master plan figure shown in the local plan, which reflects the flooding work and reflects that the housing areas are in flood zone 1 in that location. I think that the other point to just pick up, there's two other points. One, Mr. Gledhill referred to Tudley. Tudley is entirely in flood zone 1. The second point is just to pick up from what Mrs. Young mentioned. The SFRA has identified the specific abilities for development and works to the west of Paddock Wood to reduce the flood risk for existing areas of Paddock Wood, so within the centre of Paddock Wood and within western Paddock Wood, that otherwise, without, for example, Environment Agency intervention, could not be provided. The centre of Paddock Wood suffers from flooding issues, and the development on the western side would specifically provide the opportunity for defences to be put in to stop the flow of water into that part of Paddock Wood. One final point, Mr. Hayes suggested that the council has accepted that it will worsen flood risk elsewhere, and that is absolutely not the case. Council, the proposals at Paddock Wood, the SFRA.
Okay, let's not get dragged down to which is the details. I know there's a separate session on this where we could spend a bit of time to sort of understand a bit more detail, just sort of thinking about very high levels of strategic things. We'll take some different views on this. Ms. Ashton, I think lady next to you.
Thank you, sir. Keeping it at a strategic level, and going back to the question you asked just before, in terms of you can have an area that you allocate for development that includes both flood zones 1, 2 and 3, but you don't have to necessarily develop over the totality of that area, and that is the point. If you look at the David Locke Associates Master Plan document, it has within it on page 67, figure 5 is the constraints and designs parameters for Paddock Wood, and that identifies within it the extent of the flood risk areas. And then if you go to page 85, I think it is of that document, page 95, that also shows the development parcels in the context of the flood risk areas and breaks them down into flood zones 2, 3 and 3B. And then if you look at the actual chosen option 1, and you look at the development parcels within that, which is on page 83, you can see within that the development parcels have been basically arranged around the areas of flood risk, so that built development is outside of the areas of flood risk, it is all within flood zone 1. Yes, there is development within flood zone 2 and potentially flood zone 3 in terms of connectivity. There are links that are being produced that do go through areas of flood risk, but they are not residential development, and there is difference in that. The other point I just wanted to make is if you go back to para 161 of the NPPF, and in particular subparagraph C, about actually using development within certain areas of flood risk to provide opportunities to actually address existing problems of flood alleviation, which is exactly what is being proposed in Paddock Wood. At the current moment in time, as has been alluded to, there are significant issues of flood risk in Paddock Wood. And I know it sounds counterintuitive to suggest that you have development within an area that potentially is at flood risk, and therefore you can address an existing problem, but you can. It's an issue of engineering, and it's an issue of management and mitigation. I'm not an engineer, I can't explain it to you. They probably could, but we'd all fall asleep. That is what is being proposed here. And that is the core of the approach that has been adopted by the council, by its consultants, and all those that are looking to promote development in Paddock Wood. And it is clearly understood and set out in the policy as well. The policy is quite clear about what we need to do to address that issue.
Yeah, ladies, you're right.
Thank you, sir. Jane Piper on behalf of Crest Nicholson, northwest of Paddock Wood. I just wanted to, it's actually addressing the point that Ms Young was making about where it's set out. Ms Ashton's just said about the NPPF, but actually in the PPG on flooding as well. There's reference when talking about the exceptions test, and obviously, as pointed out by the council, this hasn't, it's not necessarily required at this stage, but it was done. And the point of that is that it can help to demonstrate and ensure that flood risk to people and property can be managed in a satisfactory way. And said essentially the two parts of the test require proposed development to show that they will provide wider sustainability benefits to the community that outweigh flood risk, and that will be safer for its lifetime. We're in a situation where there are substantial sustainability benefits, but it isn't a case of outweighing the risk. As you've heard, the land has been allocated, and it's a very large amount of land for the number of units, specifically to deal with flood risk, not just from the development, but also that's already occurring for Paddock Wood. The other thing I'd like to say is in terms of safety for its lifetime. Obviously, we are now in a situation since 2021 when the EA upped their game in terms of climate change and what's required. We're actually engineering development now for flood that we have never seen, and we are very unlikely to have seen thus far, because it is about the effects of climate change, and that is the additional 40% that's required over and above the usual, what was formerly the level there. So we're in a situation where it's not just being engineered, it's not just providing benefits, but it's providing benefits to a degree that have not been seen yet. And I think that's important. As Ms Ashton said, it is that trying to get that sort of counterintuitive approach. But even at its very minimum, development cannot have any further surface water flow than the existing greenfield sites. But that's not what's being proposed here. And the policies, when taken as a whole in the local plan, which wholly concur with that set out in the NPPF, will make it much better than that, not just for the development, but for the town as well. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I think we're getting a bit more into the detailed justification right now. So any final comments from the council? No. Okay, so is there any final?
Sorry, very briefly, so I'm conscious we could go over this on in matter 6, but I just wanted, in terms of the strategic point, I just wanted to ask you, sir, to look very carefully at the timing of this master planning work, because we're told that in some way helped understand what was going on in terms of the sequential test. So that's what we're told in paragraph 87. This all took place. David Locke, as I understand it, was appointed in 2020, August 2020. The report we have is February 2021, but appreciate you would have done some work earlier to that. None of this was done, as I understand it, this master planning element was done certainly at the Reg 18 stage. And in terms of what we're looking at in terms of strategic decisions and choices being made, it seems to me that what we've heard is that there was no information at the Reg 18 stage when this strategy was decided. There was no consideration of the sequential test at that point. And that's quite fundamental to the strategic questions that you wanted to consider today in terms of spatial strategy. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of the date of the master planning work. And that's the only point I wanted to make.
So if I could just very briefly respond to that, to point out the timing of the level 1 SFRA, that very clearly shows the significant areas to the west of Paddock Wood that are in flood zone 1. The distribution of development topic paper, I think it was called, paragraph for document 3, CD 3.16, which informed the draft local plan, provided the council's justification in relation to flooding and specific reference to Paddock Wood, all of which preceded and informed the draft local plan. The master planning work did come subsequent to that, but there was consideration, there was the evidence to inform the draft local plan at that point. It was then developed through the master planning post-draft local plan.
Okay, I will look at that. Thank you all. We'll adjourn for lunch then, and we'll resume at 2 o'clock.